I am certain that a lot of white supremacists say that, and I don't even think they believe it. But remember that you've observed certain wicked peoples have lied about who they are. They've lied about history.
If you knew what you were made of, then we would save the world.
What's going on, people? Welcome to the King Mono Show. Now, you guys don't know this, but this is literally my umpteenth attempt at recording today. I'm really having one of those days where maybe I should just be listening to listening to the universe and giving up before I try and get started again. Well, what can I say, man? I'm a glutton for punishment. Welcome to the King Mono Show, and today I'm going to be grading Marquette on his performance in this breaking down of ancient Egypt. I'm just joking. I'm not going to be grading him. If that's in the thumbnail, it's just clickbait. I'm just going to be responding lightly to the kind of things that he's said, seeing how well or how true it stacks up and measures up. Responding to it, it's always good to see. By the way, this isn't me trying to SHIT on another creator, because I think it's always good to see us engaging with our history as much as possible, and evidently we've all been lied to. So really, a lot of my perspectives, even if I've got supporting evidence and data, still remain subjective. We're very far from what is an objective consensus of what history looks like. I've seen some of his videos before. I've reacted to a couple, and I liked some of his responses. So I saw this one pop up, and I thought, oh, this would be an interesting response. So let's react to this live and see how Marquette's arguments regarding the ancient Egyptian civilization hold up to scrutiny. Let's go.
Try to stop playing Trey. He writes, a lot of the whites truly believe that ancient Egyptians were not black. I don't think they believe that. I am certain that a lot of white supremacists say that, and I don't even think they believe it. But remember that you've observed certain wicked peoples have lied about who they are. They've lied about history. For example,
So before he starts there, I'll just talk about where does the broader consensus lie with the race of the ancient Egyptians currently? Well, I would say, Egyptologically speaking, so the professionals, they've moved on a lot more than the general public and the mainstream has. And that's largely due to the rise of Pharaonism and the gatekeeping of the study of ancient Egypt by the modern Department of Antiquities in Egypt, who makes it very hard for archaeologists to be overt and outspoken about who they believe the ancient Egyptians are. They even make it hard for you to just basically make analogies and comparisons between the ancient Egyptian civilization and modern African civilizations, of which there is huge amounts of overlap. So Egyptologically speaking, if you get a lot of these Egyptologists privately, they will tell you unequivocally that the ancient Egyptians were an African civilization. They likely presented as Africans, and their culture, everything about them, was African. The general public, however, who's more influenced by what hits the media, what hits the news, what grabs the headlines, they're going to be largely of the perspective that they believe the ancient Egyptian civilization was most closely aligned, or most closely phenotypically aligned to the modern Egyptian civilization. And that's come as a result of very concentrated and a continued campaign of propaganda that has been fronted by what is called Pharaonism. Essentially, that's really affected the way A, the current Egyptian populace view themselves, and B, how the public view the ancient Egyptian civilization. And this Pharaonism idea has been propagated quite heavily for at least the last 40 to 50 years.
Entire continent of people that call themselves Australians, but they're not Australian. They're really British, right? They came from Britain. Australia was started as a penal colony. So of course, we know that peoples move and relocate. We know that peoples conquer peoples. The Aborigines to Australia, the original people there, they are dark-skinned people. And they are still there. They're just there in much lower numbers because the Australians eradicated them through great violence. Right? Have you ever done any live?
So just really quickly, I just want to kind of like add on to what he's saying here. He's basically making the argument or the issue that we have regarding people having a very anachronistic view about the ancient Egyptian civilization based on presentism. In other words, they're trying to judge what the world looked like based on what the world currently looks like. And he's basically invalidating that claim based on the fact that if we took that argument to somewhere like Australia or America and several other places in the world, even many places in Asia, people just take for granted that all of these populations are the same as the ancient populations, but often there have been population replacements, there have been migrations, there have been introgressions, there have been several events, settlings of outsider groups that have changed the demographic of cities, towns, lands, land masses, and nations. So he's making a good point there.
Lives on the history and lessons of ancient Egypt. Yes, I touched on it a bit. There's an Arab comedian, actually. This is ironic. Yeah, he's a comedian by trade, and he's Egyptian, air quotes. He's Arab, right? So he speaks Arabic. And where's
So I think he's talking about Bassem Youssef here. He has been incredibly outspoken against the Afrocentric community, which is what they call you when you're an Afrikaner or a black scholar who's promoting an African link to the ancient Egyptian civilization.
Arabic come from? Does it come from Egypt? No, it comes from Saudi Arabia. You're Arab. But they too claim Egyptian as their own. And this is not surprising, you know, a great civilization. We all like to be associated with great things.
Just to kind of jump in there as well, sorry, it feels like I'm jumping in every second, but the Arabic language is actually a Semitic language. And when we talk about Semitic, we're talking about a language phylum that belongs to the Afro-Asiatic group. The Afro-Asiatic group basically is a group of languages that do sound, Semitic languages sound very similar, but the Afro-Asiatic group is based on 5 branches, which are Semitic, Chadic, Berber, Omotic, and ancient Egyptian. No, Cushitic, and ancient Egyptian. So that's 6. I think I said 6 there, but I think that's all of them. And basically, it's thoroughly African. All of those groups have their roots firmly on the African continent. The only one that actually exists outside of the African continent is the Semitic group. And even that, there's many Semitic languages in the African continent, like Tigrinya and Amhara, that sit inside the African continent. So even within the African continent, we have these languages that are Semitic. But the point being, Afro-Asiatic should not be called Afro-Asiatic. It's an African language group. All of the African groups, or all of the groups in the Afro-Asiatic group, exist in the African continent. And even the one, the Semitic, there's a very strong argument to suggest that that was birthed on the African continent, since we have very, very old scripts in the Ge'ez language of Ethiopia, which is another Semitic one, which many people suggest predate the earliest iterations of Arabic. And even Arabic in itself, the script looks like it could have been devised from ancient Egyptian Demotic script. At least that's where they would have borrowed some of the characters from. So there's very, very long and kind of like convoluted arguments, but the point being made that I was making was not to contradict what Marquette has correctly stated, that, you know, Arabic came from Arabia, which is in the Arab Peninsula, which historically was Northeast Africa anyway. But the point I was making was that all of these languages, these language groups, the roots of them all trace back to Africa anyway. Africa is underrated when it comes to the realm of language, linguistics, and writing, of which the world, and when I say the world, I mean kind of like the local world, being Asia, Europe, Far East, and Africa. They have a huge debt to owe to Africa when it comes to their language and their writing, because Africa birthed them all. But anyway, we're carrying on from there.
But anyways, I did a response to him. I think his name, I'm not going to say his name because it doesn't matter what his name is. I actually remember his name. And I did a live on that, dispelling some of the nonsense that he said. But there's a great amount of research. The truth is known, but the truth is, it is suppressed. And that is not new. That's not new at all. I was recently in Egypt, and one thing that I noticed is when you look at the monuments as they get older and older, they get blacker. And as they become more recent, they become more Caucasoid. And it reflects the true trajectory of Egypt. Like, for example,
I really agree with him here, but I have to just jump in and say they've been doing a very good job. And when I say good, I mean ironically, they've been a very good job in Cairo, for instance. But a lot of the Egyptian monuments are being heavily tampered. So now, when you meet an Egyptian, they'll all tell you, "Look at the old kingdom monuments; they look like us." And me being in this space for a long time know that historically, no, Old Kingdom doesn't look anything like you. Old Kingdom statues look really hyper African. But what they've been doing, and they have an entire exhibit to this in the new Grand Egyptian Museum in Egypt, is they've been tampering. They've been painting all of these Old Kingdom statues a brand new brick red so that they, physically match kind of like more the Saidi population. They've been tampering and they've been contouring facial features, everything, and obviously then they've been put into the front and center many of their faked artifacts as well. So this is all compounding together to give this illusion that the old kingdom looked the most Arab, but then as they progressed towards the new kingdom, it started looking more African, which is the total reverse, just like Marquette is saying here, the total reverse of which we know to be true. So one of the things that I at least have benefited of is that I haven't only been to Egypt. I've been various places around the world, museums, and I've been able to look at exhibits that have escaped the curse of the curators and the restorers' hand that you have in Egypt currently, where they're restoring everything to their likeness and their image. And if you want to get a true depiction of what the ancient Egyptians look like, sometimes you got to go to museums and see. For instance, the Neues Museum in Berlin has some fantastic Fifth Dynasty steles, really brilliantly detailed, which just show indisputably African features that were taken from Saqqara. However, if you go to Saqqara, near enough all of the tombs now have had the restorer's brush. So there's this really delicate kind of conflict that is existing between how the ancient Egyptian artifacts looked or used to look and how they look now, which is really changing and affecting people's perception of the ancient Egyptian civilization. And this is why the modern Egyptian people are becoming more and more emboldened as the day passes, because they know they are changing the visage of the ancient Egyptian civilization, and it's making them feel like they're more connected than they are.
There are certain features that people have based on their racial category, and race is in fact a real thing, though people lie about that. So for example, and mind you, I don't have the most the archetypal Negroid face based on the extreme of certain racial categories, but my face is very Negroid.
Marquette's got quite a I'd say he's got a I think he's got quite a strong Nubio-Kemetic phenotype. I've seen artifacts that certainly look like Marquette.
And so there's a couple of things that I'll note for you that I observed in the ancient Egyptian remains. When you go farther back, so when you get 4,000 years back, you'll notice that the brow bone, right? So the nose will curve. So like the nose will go from the brow bone, there'll be a curve and a smoothness and a sloping in. This is not the typical shape of the European nose. The European nose, and Europeans have a little different DNA than, say, Africans. For example, Europeans have Neanderthal DNA.
Okay, so before he goes any further into the DNA aspect, I just want to jump in on the phenotypic aspects that he's picking up on here. And once again, I think it's quite astute that he's picked up on this kind of like this nose feature, because a lot of people will miss that. But he's talking about the dorsal ridge. The only reason I know this, by the way, is because I do facial reconstructions based on the artwork, and they're becoming increasingly forensic as time's going on, but let's just say they're based on the artwork for now. So at the moment, I'm able to distinguish what the telling features are of ancient Egyptian artwork, and he's spot on in regards to what he's talking about here in regards to a dorsal ridge. Ancient Egyptians tend to have relatively strong nose bridges, like he does, like myself. So if you look at the existing artwork, it's very rare they have completely flat nose bridges. What they tend to have is quite strong nose bridges, but then the dorsal ridge will be concaved. So they have a concave dorsal ridge, which will lead to kind of like a very slight turn in the nose. So actually very similar to, and I'm not just saying this, but it's actually very similar to my nose from a profile view. I have exactly that. I have a nose bridge. It's very, very present. but then the tip of my nose is very soft as well. So if you talk about when it gets to the tip of the nose and when it comes to the nares, everything about the ancient Egyptian phenotype, the nose, is a very soft, rounded presentation. They never show pointy features. Now, you do see it in some of the mummies, but most of the time that is like Ramesses II, for instance, but most of the time that's traceable back to a process called transnasal craniotomy, which was the process of breaking the nose of the mummy in order to extract the brain. You know, they had to remove all of the organs before mummification, and they decided, you know, somewhere towards the Middle Kingdom that their preferred method of extraction was to break the basically break the nose bridge and extract the brain through the nose, which caused some of them, such as you see in Yuya and in Ramesses and some of the other mummies, to have pronounced kind of like nose bridges. Now, as much as that can be a trait, and it is a trait you've seen locally amongst East Africans, so it's not like it's a trait that's unseen amongst Africans. Africans do have it. We also have to be aware of the contributing factors that can create that phenotype as well. But yes, like you said, for most part, the artwork, you're going to see a concave dorsal ridge that is, you know, a very kind of like a sloping in nose bridge, like we see the mummy mask of King Tutankhamun, and always leads to a very soft and rounded tip and nares. So yeah, very, very well, quite astute for him to pick that out. Really quite impressed.
Whereas Africans do not, or blacks or people in the Negroid category do not. So from the brow bone, Caucasians, which would be inclusive of Arabs and Europeans, right? Their nose will come from the brow bone and be fairly straight, right?
I also just want to point out really quickly, I'm impressed that you picked out the Neanderthal aspect as well, because this is Neanderthal contribution is one of those things that could actually end this argument very, very quickly. Africans, by and large, have none or very trace amounts of Neanderthal ancestry. This is what we've seen in all of the ancient Egyptian mummies that they've pulled up, which is why they don't like testing for it. Modern Europeans all have 2 to 4%. That's universally across modern Europeans, so it's not like this is disputable. In fact, if we was going to argue about this concept and this social construct called race that doesn't really play itself biologically into mankind's history, one of the easiest signifiers and most consistent signifiers of race, so to speak, is Neanderthal ancestry. And there's also a few genes that are related to light skin, such as the SLC45A2 and the SLC245A, and the MC1R, and there's another one, TYR, I think it's called. So we've got kind of like 4 genes. These are things that we could look for that could really just end this dispute about what race. And when we're talking about race, we're really just talking about phenotype. Was this person white? Was this person black? Was this person something else? The easiest one is to look at Neanderthal ancestry, because only black Africans have it in 0 to trace amounts. All other non-African groups have it in much higher. And then obviously once you get to the Far East, you get the Denisovan contribution as well amongst Asians, where they have it at high amounts, as do the Aboriginals as well. But if you look at black Africans, they're the only ones who have Neanderthal ancestry at 0 to trace amounts. They don't want to test that because they know all of the outcomes are going to be that the ancient Egyptians have similar Neanderthal contribution to modern Africans. So they'll want to test things that they can be in control of the outcomes via interpretation. They can interpret haplogroups any way they like. They can interpret autosomal DNA any way they like by running it through their little complex algorithms and doing their QPADM tests and their admixture tests and their outgroup analysis, you know, to measure distances. They can do whatever they like. They can muddy those. But when we just say, look, let's just make this really simple. You guys have a load of Neanderthal in you. We don't. What about the ancient Egyptians? Oh, it's not scientific. Of course it isn't. Of course it isn't, because you know what the outcome is going to be. They're going to cluster with us if that becomes the variable in which we are kind of like analyzing outputs. That becomes the Klein that we're looking at. You don't want that to be the Klein. You want to create Kleins of your own, ones that suit your analysis.
It's not going to have that curvature through like that. So their noses are bigger. Their noses have more volume, and their noses will come from the brow bone more straight. It kind of like more bisects the face. Then also another racial feature with the blacks, they'll have an upper lip, whereas and an upper and lower lip, whereas the Caucasoids, the whites, they'll typically have a much more reduced upper lip. So it'll be more on like the order of like something like this, like much more reduced, which is a racial feature.
Now, I'm going to jump in here and I'm going to say, in fairness to the argument, I'm with him on these arguments, by the way, but just in fairness to the argument regarding the lips, modern Egyptians that actually carry kind of like that kind of like Greco-Roman Saidi kind of mixture, they tend to have lips. So it's not a case that they are a lipless population. Many of the ones up north that are recent Turkic Slavic ancestry as a result of the Black Sea slave trades and the Mamluk infiltration, and the post-colonial settling of various groups as well. They tend to have the really thin lips. Like, for instance, if you look at Bassem Youssef and Zahi Hawass, their phenotype, to be quite frank, is just not represented in ancient Egypt. They look nothing like the stele artworks. They look nothing like the statues. They don't have the feature set to match. I do. Marquette does. They don't. And so as a result, they don't match. But if you look at some of the modern Egyptian population, particularly those with high Saidi ancestry, and I do believe that many of the Saidi Egyptians do carry native ancestry. They do carry it. I'm not saying they carry it 100%. I think the 100% representation would be seen in people such as the Nubians, or anyone with kind of like basically an African presenting African. They're the ones that carry it. Okay, I've got ancient Egyptian ancestry. The Saidis have it to a mixed degree, but many of these northern Egyptians, or these Egyptians that are in these, I wouldn't say port cities, I'd say these tourist hubs such as the Fayum, Alexandria and Cairo, they're the ones that carry the ancestry in these, well, actually don't carry the ancestry. They're the ones that look, like he said, with the thin lips and the very pale skin, and they present as very Arab, and they tend to be incredibly racist.
Then obviously the coiling of the hair, the coil indicates race. The bone density indicates race. Height indicates race. Skeletal structure indicates race. There's certain Asians that have much longer torsos. They might not proportionally, and you'll observe this not only in Asians but also in indigenous people, like the Guatemalans. So have shorter legs, longer torsos, as say compared to Africans and Europeans.
So he's spot on here as well. There's been several studies. Anthropometrics used to be looked at with more seriousness until, like with all studies, when it brings up results they don't like, they'll turn around and they'll discredit it and they call it racist, and they'll say it's linked to phrenology and Hitler did it. That's what they'll eventually come out and say. But actually, if you look at the anthropometrics, and they did this even with the latest study on Neurat Man and several others, whenever they do run these bodies through anthropometry, that is the study of the human body in terms of its metrics, its measurements, they always cluster with Black Africans. Black Africans have quite a large divergence in terms of their limb proportions. Like you mentioned there, we tend to have short torsos, longer tibia, the distal segments, which are the segments that sit at the most extreme, such as your humerus and your tibia, like I mentioned already, they tend to be longer in comparison to Europeans of the same height, who will tend to have proportions such as longer torsos, shorter tibias, and this also reflects in kind of like the average size of calf muscles. Africans tend to have really thin calves, but that's because their calves are stretched, as opposed to Europeans and then Asians who have the shortest but then have the biggest calves because their calves are condensed. So you see these difference in limb proportions, which to me also show a direct correlation with admixture of these outside hominids such as the Neanderthal and the Denisovan, which will have an impact on the way the body physiognomically presents itself. Default Homo sapiens sapien, which would be the African man, is someone who has a long wingspan, that's long arms, okay, that equate to longer than our height. So take your Vitruvian proportions and push them out of the window, because essentially Africans tend to be on average almost 10% above the Vitruvian proportions when it comes to wingspan. This is why we always have a reach advantage when it comes to boxing matches, and you've got two boxers of the same height and the same weight class. We tend to have longer tibias and shorter torsos. That is the African proportions. I've heard it being called a tropical adaptation. I relent on calling it that, but I just call it default Homo sapiens sapien, and I call what they have an adaptation, because essentially they are the later evolution. We have to assume that the default presentation of mankind, Homo sapiens sapien, unadmixed with Neanderthal and Denisovan, is the black African. That's the only logical and sane assumption anyone would make if they had any knowledge about human anthropology over since over the last couple hundred thousands of years. So I would say that. But yes, he has a good point in that the ancient Egyptians consistently, and when I say consistently, I don't think there's been many cases outside of this, consistently cluster with black Africans when it comes to their limb proportions.
And then, of course, the shape of the eye is a racial indicator too, which you'll have the epicantic eye fold, which will be typically
and his eyes are typically black as well, and typically Egyptian. The heavy eyelids, the larger, the kind of more protruding eyes. I need to find out what the kind of technical name for that is, but that is very ancient Egyptian. It's also very African. It's also very rare amongst modern Egyptians, modern Arabs, who tend to have much more deep set eyes. Even so that kind of protruding eye socket is one of the key features, and one of the reasons why when you remake a statue of an ancient Egyptian, it will tend to lean towards looking Africans. If you look at the reconstructions made by reconstruction artists attempting to make the ancient Egyptians look like the local Arab population, look at the eyes. Yeah, remember I said that to you. Look at the eyes. When they make their reconstructions, look at the eyes, and you'll see that they never match the ancient Egyptian eyes. Look at reconstructions done by African or black reconstruction artists like my own, and you'll see a complete match from eyes, nose, lips. Everything will match, and what you'll see is a very, very African looking final phenotype.
Assigned to the Asian or the indigenous, which, by the way, the African has the genetic code of everyone. The black man and woman have the genetic code of everyone, which is why you can see blacks with tightly coiled hair. You can see blacks with more straight hair. You can see blacks that have albinism, which is to say devoid of pigment. You can see blacks that are extraordinarily dark. You can see blacks that have eyes like mine, which is to say rounded with a pronounced eyelid. You can see blacks who have an epicantic eye fold, which is like very much so like what you would expect a true-born Chinese to have.
And just to jump, he's done a very good job here. What he's essentially summarizing is something that I call African phenotypic diversity. Africans have the broadest genetic diversity in the world by several factors. The African continent is several factors more genetically diverse than the entirety of the world's population. There's more genetic diversity in the country of Nigeria alone than there is across all of Europe. Okay, that's how diverse black people are. That's how diverse Africans are. That diversity reflects in phenotype as well. So often when we're talking about Africa, they give you this idea that this is what a black person looks like. And that comes from something that's essentially called the true Negro trope, which was kind of like a residual carryover of Seligman's analysis of race and his thoughts on race that have permeated our thoughts around scientific racism over the years. And this idea that the Negro is one thing, nothing could be further from the truth. What you actually have is a true European, because Europeans are all incredibly closely related and there's not much phenotypic range within them. You know, they present often very narrow subset of features, whereas Africans have all of the European features and much more. So we can be born, like he said, with the Asian features, we can be born with the European features, we can be born with, you know, the true Negro features, which are kind of like sitting whatever the European is, you just turn everything to the opposite of the European. But that doesn't then disqualify someone who presents very European looking features from being an African. It only works one way. Okay, only works one way. Africans have the broadest phenotypic diversity. And so it's almost like a cheat code when it comes to looking at, you know, ancient remains. You can't look at ancient remains, pull them up and go, that wasn't black man. You just don't know. It could be. We have the full range. Whereas you can pull it up and say that was a black man, because we have a range that sits outside of European, Asian, and other groups' capabilities. So we can look at that and say that's definitely a black man because only they have that. But there's no single trait on a skull which you could say that doesn't belong to a black person. Now, I'm not saying that I make an attempt to do it because no need to do that. Many of the, for instance, in the case of the ancient Egyptians, they have things like dolichocephaly, which is a kind of like elongation of the skull, which at kind of like anything from moderate rates onwards is only found in the African continent, and the way that it presents itself with at the out of the back of the head, that is almost distinctively and uniquely African. You don't get that in other populations. You have the prognathism that they exhibit. You have the diastema, the overjet and overback that they exhibit. Very regional East African traits. You have the post-bregmatic depression in the skull, which I have, which a lot of black people have. I think Marquette has it from the look of it, which they exhibit. These are all very, very African traits, and they then have the limb proportions, and you mush these all together, you know for a fact that you're dealing with a black person. For any European or white person or even Arab to exhibit all of those traits would be each one is rare enough for it to be bizarre. But you know how probabilities work. You have to take a low probability, multiply it by a low probability. What you get is massive. You get a very, very trace percentage probability that is not an African. It becomes trace, whereas opposite, obviously, it becomes very, very likely that it is an African. This is what we're dealing with when it comes to them pulling up bones, mummies, bodies in ancient Egypt. This is how African they are, and they've done such a good job at deceiving the world into thinking that this is even a debate or a discussion. It really isn't.
And you can see blacks that are tall like the Sudanese, blacks that are short like the Bushmen. So they have the genetic code of every racial category, whereas, but they don't have Neanderthal DNA. Whereas if you look at the other racial categories,
and that's a good one. I really like the Neanderthal DNA argument. I wish we could find a way of pursuing that through all. I mean, we've already proven that the New Kingdom dynasties, if those of you who don't know, there was autosomal DNA that was extracted from all of the New Kingdom pharaohs, at least the 18th and 19th dynasty pharaohs, I should say. So we've got all of them from the Ramesside and the Amarna dynasties, and they all cluster unequivocally much closer to Africans, actually surprisingly enough, Africans from the Great Lakes and Southern Africa region by several factors. You know, I'm talking about 1,400 times in case of Tutankhamun closer to them than any other group in the world. So you're talking about, you know, very much these people absolutely cluster with Africans. Now, if we was to compound that with Neanderthal analysis and compound that with the limb proportions, you can see how this argument just becomes really ridiculous.
like the Mongoloid or the Caucasoid, they cannot produce every other person, right? They cannot produce black, for example. So you can't out of European get black. You cannot out of Asian get black, but you can out of black get Asian and get European or white, if you will.
Spot on. So he's just once again he just put it in a very eloquent way what I was talking about earlier in terms of the phenotypic range of black people in comparison to the other groups. They sit as subsets within the black group.
Some of these words are passé or obsolete. They're no longer in use, but they're actually useful, and they come from an anthropologically centered perspective. But anyways, I say all that to say this. When you go back in Egyptian history, you'll find that all of a sudden, the upper lip is very pronounced. You get 4,000 years back, the upper lip is there. 4,000 years back, the nose shape is just like mine. 4,000 years back, everything is negroid. Then you start to get into...
That is the noses that have survived. It's funny, noses that they bring up recently, or ones that have been knocked off. A couple that I've recently uncovered was the statue of second Waj Ra, who was a 13th dynasty pharaoh whose nose was knocked off, I believe, by the British Museum. But if you look at the original statue, because I've got old books that actually show what his original features were before the British Museum knocked off his nose is exactly like mine. Also, the recent statue they found of Amenhotep III, the recent colossal one they just erected, once again, his nose is exactly like mine. And I would also say Sahure's nose, once again, very, very similar to mine. So you have this really basically black range of noses, black range of features. These are native African features that you see being exhibited. Yet they'll try to gaslight you and make out like you're being ridiculous. Like, which ones that aren't, absolute fakes? And even the fakes that they draw for, it's kind of like these might vaguely look like you, these couple of fakes, but this is no way a generalization of what ancient Egyptian artwork looks like. On a general basis, ancient Egyptian artwork just mirrors native black Africans of the East African region. That's all it is to it.
To more recent Egyptian history after they've been conquered by who? The Assyrians, the Romans, the Arabs. They've been conquered. So yeah, the leaders are changing appearance, because that's what happens when you conquer a people. You take over the land, you give the women the old 1-2, you heard me, skeet in them. You change the racial makeup, you become the monarchs, you bring in people from other places, like people like Cleopatra. People are like, was Cleopatra white or black? Cleopatra's irrelevant. She's not even a.
You're making a good point here. I actually was very much of this mindset as well, that obviously people see these, essentially they're called intermediary periods, these periods where the dynastic periods are the periods which are the old, middle and new kingdom. But between each of those, there's a intermediary period. So you have the old kingdom in first intermediary, the middle kingdom, second intermediary, the new kingdom, and then the late period. And that's basically how they break up the different civilizations or different dispensations of the ancient Egyptian civilizations. Now, I always had this idea that the intermediary periods brought in lots of foreign integration, which then changed the demographic. I've actually kind of gone back on that a little bit, and hear me out. My suggestion is that a lot of the time the difference between the dynasties was geographic. Yeah, it depended where they were. I've really increased my appreciation for the fact that ancient Egypt, or Kemet, was a very large civilization that spanned a humongous geographic region, okay, from north to south. And those 42 Sapats, if you're going to take the most northern Sapat and the most southern Sapat, you're going to get a huge phenotypic difference between the people. And what you'll have is, depending on the dynasty, you have a you have a dynasty that's linked to a certain city. So, for instance, the 18th dynasty was linked to Waset or Thebes. Okay, you have the Hierarchopolitan dynasty, which was some of the earliest dynasties in the Old Kingdom. You have the Saite dynasties, the Tanite dynasties that came more towards the later periods, strictly speaking, the late periods, so outside of the New Kingdom. And although indigenous, some of these dynasties, and here's an interesting one, the Saite dynasty, that's where we get the word Said from, and I don't understand why no one, the Saidi people are likely mixed descendants of the Saite Sapat. Okay, so that's where the word Saidi comes from. The actual word was not Saite, it was the name of the town was Sai, and that's why we have Saidi. Okay, it was called Sai. The Greeks called it Sais, but the natives would have called it Sai. That's what the hieroglyphs spell out. A lot of these names are ancient. The old name for Aswan was Sewanet, but actually the T would have been silent, so there would have been Sewan, which actually that's just the consonants S, W, and N, which you can see the ancient Egyptians omitted the vowels, so that's just Aswan. So historically, the historical name for Aswan was Aswan. The historical name for the Said was Sai. Okay, so these dynasties do stretch back quite far when it comes to those who are carrying more indigenous blood. But sorry, I went off on a tangent. The point that I'm making is that these dynasties would have changed phenotype, because remember, when you're looking at statues, you're looking at depictions of royals, okay, not necessarily general people. The depictions of the general people, which you can see in the statuettes that show villages, etc., they always look like Africans. Okay, they stay the same from Old Kingdom to New Kingdom. Those statuettes stay a very deep, dark, chocolatey brown with a slight reddish tint to it. Okay, they stay consistent. Yeah, they show the ancient Egyptians exactly the same, the people, but then the phenotype of the rulers does change. But I think that's more linked to location along the Nile, as opposed to showing what ethnic group within ancient Kemet they are, because ancient Kemet was not an ethnic group, and I don't even think ancient Egyptian was a language. Okay, essentially it was a script, and it was a I don't want to say conglomeration, it was very much an empire. Okay, ancient Egypt was an empire that just sat along the Nile. And in essence, you had very distinctive ethnic groups that sat along the Nile as well. And depending on where it was being ruled from, just like we saw with the 25th dynasty, and we saw the what we call the Kushite or the Nubian pharaohs, they were just another iteration or another expression of another city, or a city that just sat outside of Kemet's borders that were ruling at that time. So that's my kind of thoughts around that. But I still, in general, agree with what you're saying. I think he's making an excellent point. Yes, the intermediary periods is very probable cause of contribution of outsider phenotype and a shift in the way that the ancient Egyptians looked.
Relevant person, but she definitely wasn't black. But that's in later age Egypt. That's not the pyramid building age. So when you go way back to the pyramid building age, and then here's another thing for all the people who are just liars. This is not about being pro-black. It's just about being pro-truth. So you look at people, and a people are known for a culture. They're known for their monuments, their language, and various other things. And here's some very persuasive evidence. Next time you hear a white person, or not a white person, because normal white people don't even care about this, right? You hear a white supremacist, or you hear an Arab, an Egyptian Arab lying. You ask them this. You say, okay, where does your language come from? Where in the world? Okay. So none of the languages that we associate with the Egyptians, not the people today, but the real Kemetic Egyptians, come from other places in the world. Those languages are more Sudanic, meaning going deeper into Africa.
Yeah, he makes a really good point here. I made this exact argument when I had a debate with an Egyptian, a young Egyptian man on my channel. I want to say boy, but he's not a boy, he's a man. And he's a really cool guy, actually. We got on quite well, other than when we were debating Egypt, obviously, in which we did get on well, but it got a little bit heated towards the end. But I made the point that, the argument for, indigeneity really falls apart on this point here, which is language, because Egypt really is the only nation in Africa that, as a result of Islamicization, abandoned their culture and language. No other African population did that. And Islam, let's to be very, very clear, was rampant across the Sahel and the Maghreb. It was rampant across the Sahel, the Maghreb, Sahara, and even parts of Guinea region. Islam was rampant, absolutely rampant. It made it, and in the Horn, it made itself very, very known on the African continent. And in all of these places, yes, they took on the Arabic language. Yes, they had to speak Arabic to translate and to read the Quran. But guess what they didn't abandon? They didn't abandon their native tongue. And largely, they didn't abandon their native cultures. Those remained largely intact, apart from in the landmass that is supposedly the greatest civilization in history. The reason they didn't retain it in Egypt is because they are the descendants of the people that settled and came. This is why they have retained Arabic culture. This is why they have retained the Arabic language. This is why everything they do resembles Middle Eastern patterns and doesn't resemble native African patterns. Now, many people will make the argument towards Coptic. They say, well, the Coptics still speak Coptic. It's like Coptic was never a spoken language. Coptic was a liturgical script. It was only preserved so that they could continue essentially reading scriptures. Okay, they read them in the Coptic language, and it's very similar to how the modern JWSs created Israelite by taking the dead language of Hebrew, infusing it into Yiddish, and then saying, hey, we're speaking the original ancient language. There's no continuity. That language was invented sometime in the 1970s. The same with the Coptics. They never spoke this language, but they were trying to preserve this script. And by the time they started using Coptic, it had become so infused with the different groups that had conquered ancient Kemet. For instance, the Persian dynasty had a massive impact on the way Coptic was spoken. Coptic was written in Greek. Okay, so it was written in Latin script, or should I say Greek script. Okay, Coptic was written in Greek script. It wasn't written using, Demotic. It wasn't written using the hieroglyph. It was written in Greek. Okay, and as you can imagine, that would have had a huge impact on how words were pronounced as well. So by the time the modern Egyptians are speaking Coptic, they're speaking it with a Semitic tongue and Semitic pronunciations as a result of all these later groups that have influenced the way that that language has been transmitted. But by then, it is very, very far removed from the actual ancient Egyptian script and the various tongues that were spoken on the ancient Egyptian landmass. So that's the kind of like the difference between Coptic. So he's entirely right. They didn't retain language. They didn't retain culture. They didn't retain anything. And yet they will argue only recently in the last 100 years, they were us. It's like, but you weren't saying that 100 years ago. 100 years ago, you were very, very proud to be Arab. You thought that the ancient Egyptian civilization was some backwards black African thing, and you were happily deconstructing the pyramids to build mosques. So let's be realistic about your history and the history of the ancient Kemites.
What you call Black Africa, what you call Sub-Saharan Africa. That's number one. The language traces to Africa. But here's the second thing. When you say, okay, well, Egyptians are known for being a pyramid building race. Where are your pyramids? Are there any pyramids in Saudi Arabia where you come from? No, there are none. Are there any pyramids in Europe where you come from? No, there are not. Are there pyramids in Africa? Yes, along the Nile, going towards Sudan, also known as Nubia, the Nubians.
And unfortunately, and I say unfortunately, this is a much stronger argument than a lot of people realize, because yes, we have the Sudanese pyramids, but we also have countless number of pyramids that sit currently under the deluge that is Lake Nasser. When they built the Aswan Dam and they destroyed hundreds of square miles. I want you to fathom what I've just said there. Yes, I said that correctly. Hundreds of square miles of civilization was deliberately flooded because they wanted to hide the fact that the two lands that are spoken about, okay, Lower Kemet and Upper Kemet, they wanted to hide the fact that is where Upper Kemet was. This is where a great bulk of ancient Egyptian civilization was. And they thought, if we can just restrict it to this northern region above the first cataract, if we can restrict it to there, we've got the best chance of convincing the world that this thing wasn't Black African. And if you don't think that was their motive, then you know too little about history. You know too little about imperialism. You know too little about colonialism for us to even be able to have this conversation. The destruction of what was indisputably Black African civilization by the building of the Aswan Dam and the flooding of what was the Isle of Meroe, what was the landmass that we today would have called Nubia. The deliberate destruction of those artifacts was not an accident. It was the smoking gun that would have ended this debate, and that's why they deluged it. The fact that we know that happened in history should be the end of this discussion. Yes, and by the way, that would have been classified as being sub-Saharan, even though that's a word that I think is a swear word and shouldn't be used. It's a Central African achievement, and it was deliberately flooded because they didn't want Black people or the world to know that Black people were responsible for this great civilization, because it would have caused everything else that they were twisting, lying and whitewashing to unravel. So excellent point again there, Marquette.
So we see that when you trace the way the gods are depicted, the way the religion is, the language, the pyramids, the architecture, it gets blacker and blacker and blacker, especially as you go back, but it traces down. You can find more of that culture deeper in Africa, but you cannot find that culture deeper in Saudi Arabia or deeper in Europe. So it's very clear as to the origin of this culture. Now,
and just to be clear as well, he's beginning to touch on here about cultural continuity as well. And this is really where a lot of the argument stays, kind of like, this is where a lot of the arguments outside go to die when it comes to ancient Egyptian civilization. It's a very simple question that he's asking here. Where is it? Where is it? Where is it in your current culture? Tell me anything that you're doing currently that is reflected on the stele artwork of the ancient Egyptians. There's none. There's zero cultural continuity. However, just look south and you'll see every single cultural norm that's exhibited in ancient Kemet is exhibited amongst African groups. I did a short recently about the fact that they used to grind millet and grind flour and grind exactly the same grinding stone, exactly the same mortar and pestle that the modern Africans do today. Same hairstyle, even the women would have their breasts out, their chests out. That's an African thing. Don't tell me that Arabians have ever had that. You never, that's not your culture, that's African culture. You know, we could talk about the dances that they used to do. I found the pre-dynastic statues that are doing the Igisha Kamba and the Amaraba dances of the Ugandan slash Rwandan slash Burundi region. We can talk about the cattle that they farm, the Ankore Watusi cattle, the Shanga cattle, which is Africa's domestic breed, which is still farmed to this day. You can talk about the perfume cones that the women used to place upon their head to have a beautiful, rich fragrant throughout the day, which is still practiced amongst many of the Omotic people. You could talk about the red ochre they place upon their skin, which you can see amongst the Omo and the Himba people. There's just every single trend that you see, even the women, the virgin women who wear nothing but the usek, and they dance, they do a virgin dance, and they have their chest and their breasts exposed. This is practiced amongst the Nguni people of Southern Africa to this day in exactly the same way. The cultural continuity of the ancient Egyptian culture and modern Africans is indisputable. There's nothing that you can see practiced, and they try and give you this whole all that crap, or like, oh yeah, Arab, and then they play all this kind of like Arabic music, and that's not ancient Egyptian civilization. Ancient Egyptian civilization is essentially tribal African civilization. That's what it was. It was African civilization. It's everything that we deride the African continent for is exactly what the ancient Egyptians lived and how they lived on a daily basis. Their hairstyles, they wore their hair in afros or twists or fades or waves. They were just African. They were just essentially black people, and they expressed it in artwork. They chiseled it onto walls in the hope that that would be enough for people not to steal their identity. But hey, when it comes to the Eurasian or the Eurocentric, I could say, they don't really have a bottom when it comes to self-respect. They'll do anything to claim things that have nothing to do with them.
Was the culture conquered and infiltrated? Absolutely. But it is as ludicrous to say that the people in Egypt today are Egyptian as much as it is to say that the people in America today are the original indigenous or natives of America. It's just not true. The natives of America look nothing like Donald Trump. They look a lot like people who are darker skinned and look nothing like Donald Trump.
You know, that reminds me of the Capac Kuna Inca King list. Feel free to look that up, the Capac Kuna. If you want to see what the original Native Americans look like, here's a spoiler alert. They look very melanated, okay? That copper toned, you know, that was so frequently spoken about, that is probably not far, probably just slightly darker than Marquette's complexion was the kind of average. And I don't think any of these groups were that binary in terms of how they appeared. I believe that actually most continents around the world, including Europe, had very, very mixed groups and very, very mixed phenotypes, not these fixed single racial groups that we've been forced into, like blocks being forced, like square pegs being forced into round holes around the world. And this is why you have so many groups that have, you know, like Nigeria, that has so many ethnic groups in such a small geographic space. One of the reasons why as many of those people have been forced there. But anyway, that's an aside. The point he's making, once again, it stands. This is the be all and end all. This is the kind of like, this is the field goal. This is the score. At the end of the day, populations can change, and also can change very rapidly. He's given the example of America. I would also give the example of Europe, many Asian nations. Obviously, he's talked about the Australias. These places look nothing like they looked historically. We've talked about a rapid expansion of a certain group of people. Big hint, the Yamnaya expansion, okay? It's still going on to this day. So even people who have this idea that the W race is a shrinking flower, a shrinking violet, a race that is under threat and is disappearing, that's not even true. They're actually expanding rapidly and have been doing so for the past several hundred years. And don't let their propaganda fool you. They are as numerous as they ever have been, and they've been incredibly aggressive and incredibly efficient with their various methods of genoing the rest of the world's population. But he's absolutely correct when it comes to look at the demographics of these nations, compare those demographics to the historic demographics, they are not the same. You can just do the limb proportion thing. If you don't want, if you're in denial, if you're modern, feel free to get your limb proportions and get your head measured. See if you've got that dolichocephaly. See if you've got that post-brachmatic depression. See if you've got that concave dorsal ridge. See if you've got those, that subnasal prognathism. See if you've got those African limb proportions. And if you check on all those boxes, then hey, we can have a conversation. You just might be related to the ancient Kemites. I have all of those things, by the way, and that's just by nature of me being black. I'm not saying I'm related to the ancient Egyptians. I'm just saying, as a black person, hey, this is how I present.
But if you were to take a look at our history for the last couple hundred years, you'd be like, yeah, Americans, they're white. Recently, they're white. But if you go back 4,000 years, they're not white no more, which is just to say that there's been a lot of cultural theft, and it is in the favor of the people who are currently dominating to lie about history and to assign all of the best things and all the best accomplishments to themselves. And I totally understand that. And oppositely, to assign the worst qualities to those whom they deem to be less than, to those whom they don't want to rise up.
I was talking to a author recently called Clive Grandison. He speaks about this. This is called a part of evolutionary psychology, essentially, where you don't want your competitor outgroups, particularly ones as capable as the black race. And this is what you need to understand: the aggression against the black race is because the Eurocentrics, the white racists, they know the historical capabilities. They are fooling you. They are saying to the rest of the world and to you, out of the side of their mouth, oh, you guys are useless. You guys are just a bunch of slaves. You're no competition to us. You've never done anything. And yet you see the most aggressive and overt deconstruction methods over and over again being used to derail and to place obstacles and to keep black people, because they essentially know, as an outgroup, we are more than capable competition. In fact, if we're given a level playing field, it's very likely, just by default of being the oldest race, that there's going to be a level of outperformance. And I think there's a huge amount of fear that comes from that. I don't even like talking like that, because it sounds like people will accuse me of being a black supremacist, and I just don't like talking like that. I don't think it's necessary. But this is still a reality that we have to face up to when it comes to evolutionary psychology. This is how they are perceiving you, whether or not you're willing to acknowledge it or accept it. There is a huge fear when it comes to the capabilities of the black racial group, and that's just a fact.
So the arguments are fairly goofy, and they also try to focus you on the wrong things. Like, for example, the Cleopatra thing. They try to make her so famous because she is, in fact, in recent Egyptian history, not in ancient Egyptian history. She's in recent Egyptian history. And
absolutely spot on. Ptolemaic dynasty, 30th dynasty, arguably the last Egyptian dynasty. And I will give it to them. It is a foreign dynasty, but I will call them an ancient Egyptian dynasty, because I class ancient Egyptian dynasties as those that, to some degree or another, honored the civilization that they were walking into. They didn't come and say, we're just going to extract and destroy like the later Arabs did, and to some degree like the Christians did. Very much the Coptics were responsible for far more destruction than any other period of time. Even the Coptics caused widespread destruction, yet these people now want to come and say we are the closest related to the ancient Egyptians, and in reality they are the foreign descendants of the Greeks who were then Christianized. But that's an aside. The point being, and the point that he's raising, is that the 30th dynasty is right at the tail end of the ancient Egyptian civilization. It was way past all of their notable achievements, and Cleopatra is very much kind of like she's a straw man argument. She's not she's not important to discussion that's being had. No serious, kind of like, not even serious, not even casual intermediate person who's interested in ancient Egypt as a civilization is making a serious argument about whether or not she was black. And yes, she probably did have large amounts of black native ancestry, given where she sat, but I'm not going to make an argument. Well, it's not a hill that I'm willing to die on, or even to base an argument on. If you want her if you want to claim her as looking like modern Greeks, feel free, you can have her. There's a bigger like civilization that's more important that we first established as being African before her. So I agree.
She's Caucasian, so they want to focus on her, but she's irrelevant. And you ask them, well, what is the relevance of Cleopatra in Egyptian and world history? Like, what did she do? Did she build an extraordinary pyramid? Did she create a city? Did she win a war? Like, what is her relevance? Well, there's no relevance. She just had sexcapades. That's what she's known for. She's a famous slore. Really, it is. Somebody let me know if I'm incorrect.
I do feel like Cleopatra gets a hard rap for clapping cheeks with Mark Antony or whatever. I feel she gets a hard rap. I think one thing I do respect her for, obviously, is, and this is what's definitely underrated, is the significance of ancient Egyptian queens and the significance of female authority, and how different the African continent was in terms of gender roles compared to the rest of the world. The entire African continent has always had powerful queens throughout our history. It's not something that we just put on Hollywood and we put on a pedestal to look and to sound cool. It's literally an African philosophy. Women make very capable leaders. You can see this throughout the ancient Egyptian civilization, with one of the earliest queens, Queen Neith from the, or Neith I should say, from the Old Kingdom, right up until Amos Nefertari, Cleopatra, like he's mentioned, even Nefertari Meritmut, Queen Neferuaten. There's just loads, yeah. And if you look at other African civilizations, right next door we have Nubia, or the Meroite civilization, Queen Amani Reina. So you have the various Armani queens, or Armen queens, or Armanite queens of Nubia, who really are the most significant rulers of that kind of like time period. You look at even to West Africa, we have many of the great queens of Ile-Ife. There's just very significant contribution from women. Queen Nzinga. Just look throughout the African continent, from Congo to the southern African regions, the Nguni people. You would just see that queens are significant, and the matriarchy in terms of leadership. Even matrilinealism, that's an African seed. This is why it's something that's carried over into modern Judaism. But the idea that the lineage is carried through the woman, that's African. Europeans, the lineage is carried through the man. In Africa, the lineage is carried through the woman. So Africans in general tend to have a matrilineal society, and that's including all ancient Egyptian dynasties. So it's just important to make that little distinction there. But other than that, look, I just wanted to respond to Marquette's very capable, and I'm not sitting here as his teacher or anything like that, just wanted to respond to what I thought was, I hadn't watched it in full, that's the first time I watched it in full, but what I thought was shaping up to be a good bit of content when it came on my phone. So yeah, shout out Marquette. It's important. Like I said, we have scholars out there doing this job, intelligent people sharing the reality of not just ancient Egypt, but just generally African and Black civilizations as much as possible. So yeah, shout out to you, keep up the good work, and thank you for joining me. Peace.
If you knew what you were made of, then we would say